Hi, I'm Michael Janich. I'm the Special Projects Coordinator for Spyderco, and I'm also the designer of this, the Yojimbo. In simple terms, the Yojimbo is a smaller version of my Yojimbo 2 design, which has been part of the Spyderco product line since 2011. But simple terms don't really give this design or the other members of its family justice. Because when you look at it realistically, this is an entire family of knives, and the early members of this family really kind of defined the form of what I consider to be the modern tactical Wharncliffe knife. So Wharncliffes have been around for a long time, basically almost 200 years at this point. Originally were seen in pocket knives around the early part of the 19th century in England. But when it comes to taking the advantages of the Wharncliffe blade profile and putting those into the platform of a modern, especially a tactical folder, that is something that really Spyderco pioneered, is something that kind of gelled in my head almost 25 years ago. And what I'd like to do is kind of give you an understanding of not only the history of what led us up to the Yojimbo and all the different designs along the way, but also the changes in my mindset as far as my approach to knife design. So my very first commercial knife design, the first knife that I designed that was actually commercially produced, was a Masters of Defense Tempest. So back in 1997, Jim Ray of White Wolf Knives and Tony Marfione of Microtech paired up and created what was called Masters of Defense. So back then we were starting to see some of the first so-called tactical knife designs, if you will, but they were all being designed by engineers. They really weren't being designed by people who had any type of expertise as far as tactical knife use, martial artists, people with law enforcement backgrounds, military backgrounds, things like that. So what Jim and Tony wanted to do was to create a company that specialized in having knives designed by expert tactical users. And that was what Masters of Defense was all about. I was honored to become the fifth of the first 5 original designers, and this is what I contributed. This is actually a prototype of the Tempest design, so this one was hand ground and satin finished. This one here is actually the one that I carried for about 5 or 6 years during that time period. So this is one of the actual production versions. And when I had the opportunity to design this knife, I had about a week to do it. So it was a very short time frame to work with. So I designed it based on what I thought I knew at that time. So I had been taught, and based on my research, that a knife needed to have belly. So when you talk about belly, what you're talking about is a curve to the cutting edge here. Supposedly what that does is it allows you to have a longer edge length. So when you're cutting or slashing, it's going to cut more effectively. Also, what you wanted was to have a well-centered point. So when you have that belly sweeping up this way, if you have, in this case, a straight clip point, it brings the point of the blade right down onto the center line of the knife. So when you're thrusting with the knife, it's also a direct transfer of energy into the target. So I opted for essentially a scaled down Bowie blade with a straight clip swedge on the back of it. As far as the handle design is concerned, what I borrowed from was basically Japanese knife design. So with a folding knife, you don't have any type of a cross guard to keep your hand from sliding forward. So I wanted to make sure that you had something that fit the ergonomics of the hand to provide a good grip. When you look at Japanese knives like Ikuchis rather than Tontos, a Tonto actually has a cross guard and Ikuchi does not. What you'll typically see is this tapered shape. Since your hand also basically tapers, your fingers get shorter as you get toward the pinky. When you close your hand, it actually forms a cone. So when you place something that is tapered like this into the cone, you create a wedging effect, and that keeps your hand from sliding forward. So those were some of the primary design characteristics I tried to incorporate into the Tempest. The Tempest was a successful design, but again, it was based on what I thought I knew at that time. I was also determined to continue to learn, continue to explore things, and basically prove the theory that I had been taught, make sure that it actually stood up. What I did was went through every knife in my collection, and what I found was the knives that actually cut the best were a couple of Spyderco knives that were designed by Frank Senefonte. So you had the Senefonte 1 and the Senefonte 2, and both of these were based off of Frank's gentleman's folder designs, but what you see is a Wharncliffe blade profile. So a very straight cutting edge, and then the spine of the blade tapers down to that edge. Compared to, say, the Tempest with the belly to the blade, what I realized was that these blades for a given blade length cut better. They cut deeper, they provided much more cutting power because they transfer that power all the way to the tip. And for me, that was a huge paradigm shift as far as my understanding of blade design. Now, around the same time, what was interesting was you had Sal Glesser, the founder of Spyderco. He also attended James Keating's Riddle of Steel training camp. So I believe he attended that camp in 1999. And He came back from that camp. He was very enthusiastic about the idea of having a training program at Spyderco that would teach civilians and law enforcement officers the defensive use of knives. One of the people that he met there was a guy by the name of Burt Locke. Burt was an Army Special Forces veteran. He also was a martial arts instructor, and he was one of James Keating's disciples in the Comtech system of knife use. And basically, Sal asked Burt to set up a training program for Spyderco. It was set up on the Spyderco premises, and Burt, for a while, taught classes to civilians and law enforcement officers on the defensive knife use. So Burt taught for Spyderco for a period of time, and then he decided to relocate to Montana. When he did, Sal asked him if he could name a worthy replacement to take over what was called the Martial Blade Craft program at that time, and Burt suggested me. So I started working with Spyderco in the latter part of 2000 and teaching classes here at the Spyderco headquarters. I also had the opportunity to attend James Keating's Riddle of Steel training camp, and one of the demonstrations that he did there was really a game changer for me as far as my mindset with regard to the understanding of blade shape. So he was teaching Bowie knife tactics. So with a fighting Bowie knife, what you have is lots of belly here to the edge, but then you also have a sharpened false edge, a true false edge, a true sharpened false edge on the back. And what James was demonstrating was that because when you're cutting with the primary edge, it's possible to hit something and really create no cutting effect because you're hitting with such a large surface area. Whereas if you did what's called a back cut, where you turn the knife over, you can actually cut more effectively with a back cut than you could with the primary edge. For me, that was fascinating, and that was also a game changer with regard to my understanding of edge geometry. So I'm not going to carry a Bowie knife. It's something that's impractical. It's illegal to carry around. My thought process was, if I had a knife that cuts so well with the back edge, why not just turn it over, take that portion of the edge and make that the primary edge of a smaller, legal to carry knife? So that's exactly what I did. I started working on what became my first prototype. This is actually my handmade prototype of what I was thinking of taking a Wharncliffe style blade, perfectly straight cutting edge, and putting that into a format that basically had all the trappings of a tactical folder. So a liner lock mechanism, in this case, has a Spyderco clip, an actual Spyderco clip that I pirated from another knife, attached that to the handle. So what you have is something that is a very slim profile, still has that tapered handle shape, one hand opening, but gives you the cutting power of the Wharncliffe blade. And this kind of became, in my mind, the direction I wanted to go as far as knife design. So I've been teaching for Spyderco for a while, the early part of 2001, and Sal said, you know what, if you're going to be teaching MBC for us, you should design some knives for us as well. I agreed completely, and I quickly showed him this. He wasn't as excited about this as I had hoped, certainly because it didn't have a Spyderco hole. That was one thing, the trademark round hole in the blade. But also he was just a bit hesitant about the idea of having the Wharncliffe design. He wasn't quite sold on it. Well, around the same time, I was also writing very actively for Tactical Knives magazine. I'd written an article on a custom knife maker named Mike Snowdy. That article ended up being a springboard for him to become a full-time maker, and Mike was kind enough to offer me the opportunity to design a knife for him. He said, I want to design the ultimate neck knife. So he wanted a fixed blade. Mike wasn't making folders at that time, so he wanted a fixed blade. So what I did was I took my folding knife and I basically decided I'm going to redesign that into a fixed blade design. So again, Mike didn't embrace it immediately, but he did do this first concept model. This is a concept model with no sharp edge, but it's basically kind of a semi-finished expression of what I had in mind for that design. Again, tapered handle shape, index finger choil, which I borrowed from my friend Fred Perrin, and then that straight cutting edge and just a very compact Wharncliffe style blade. That led to the full-blown custom version. This one happens to be a Damascus version. It was made by Mike Snowdy, and Mike produced these for a period of about 1 or 2 years, selling these as custom knives as part of his selection. But I showed this to Sal, and Sal liked it. He's like, you know what, we don't do a whole lot of fixed blades. We want to expand into that market. Not quite as crazy about your folder, but this is something we definitely want to embrace. So what this did was it inspired the Spyderco production version, which is interesting because Sal categorized this as essentially a sprint run of a knife. These days we would call that a flash batch. So doing a limited number of knives that had never been produced before, that was basically what he had in mind. So this is produced in Japan. It became the Spyderco expression of the Janich Snowdy Ronin. And again, what it did was it kind of started to get that concept of, hey, the Wharncliffe blade is a viable tactical weapon. And that really, again, in my opinion, was the start of that entire genre of knives as far as the tactical Wharncliffe. Sal was still interested in having me design some type of a folding knife. So what I did was I took the concept of my original prototype and then took some of the design characteristics that were kind of signature Spyderco elements, like the trademark round hole, started to put those together, put pen to paper, and came up with my folding knife design. Originally was considered to be the folding Ronin. Quickly after that, I chose the name Yojimbo, which means bodyguard in Japanese. It's also one of my favorite samurai movies, Akira Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune. So that became the start of the Yojimbo folding knife design, completed those drawings, and during 2001 we basically kind of went back and forth as far as refining those designs. We did different drawings, we did different plastic models, and kind of fine-tuned that design. So in late 2002 we formally contracted for the knife, but I was starting to get impatient. I thought that, you know, things should move a little bit faster. Part of it was my impatience, part of it was my lack of understanding of the knife industry in general. So what I decided to do was to stir things a little bit, and I reached out to Mike Snoddy, who still owed me a favor, and I said, hey, would you be willing to take this design and make a one-off? I want to validate the design, and I would also like to show the world kind of what I'm up to. So Mike did a one-off design of my original Yojimbo design. This one has titanium liners, liner lock mechanism, contoured carbon fiber scales, D2 blade, and is just a beautiful, beautiful knife. This is one of my most prized possessions, and this was something that, again, validated the whole concept in my mind because it gave me a true prototype to work with. And also what it did was kind of showed the world, again, what we're up to, stirred some interest, and kind of lit a fire under Spyderco to be able to drive forward with the Yojimbo project. So that was followed by the Spyderco production version of the Yojimbo. So the Yojimbo, what's interesting about it is that when you look at the handle to blade length ratio, you see that it's offset. It has a relatively short blade compared to a longer handle, and that was on purpose. Back then you could still carry knives on airplanes, even under heightened security. If there was a security alert, you could carry a 3-inch blade on an airplane. I was traveling a lot during that time, so what I wanted was something that I can carry legally no matter what. So I designed it for a 3-inch blade. The handle itself was designed to be longer so that it gave you the capability to use as an impact weapon in the closed position. That's something that I'm not as concerned about these days as far as my approach to knife design, but back then it was something that made sense to me. So the Yojimbo was produced in IBM blue. My goal back then was to have it done in a denim colored material. So part of my design specs was to have this basically done in denim, ideally with a blued clip, and that would give me essentially urban camouflage that would blend in with jeans. Unfortunately, at that time, we didn't have the vast number of colors of G10 that's available today. You basically had 4 colors. You had IBM blue, black, red, and white. So this is as close as they could come at the time. What's also interesting to note was this is one of the first compression lock mechanisms that Spyderco produced, along with the Gunting, along with the original version of the paramilitary. So it's produced in blue. Later that was joined by a black-handled version, and these became successful products for Spyderco. But again, what we were doing was we were kind of swimming upstream as far as getting people to embrace the concept of the tactical Wharncliffe. It wasn't super successful, and also around this time, leading into 2004, I left my job at Paladin Press and I went to work full-time with Blackhawk Products Group. I was essentially managing and operating competing knife companies that were competing against Spyderco in the marketplace. So didn't make much sense for me to be promoting a knife, even one with my name on it, if it was being made by a competing manufacturer. So Sal and I remained friends. They decided to discontinue the original Yojimbo, and I went and worked for Blackhawk from 2004 to 2009. 2009, Blackhawk kicked me to the curb, basically de-emphasized all their knife production and everything, and I was looking for an opportunity. So I returned to Spyderco, said, you know, hey, I'm looking for an opportunity and I would like to have a full-time opportunity if you have it. They were kind enough to offer me a job as the Special Projects Coordinator, which I've been doing ever since then. So in late 2009, Sal approached me and he said, you're working for Spyderco full-time, we would like to have you design a knife for us again. What would you like to design? My answer was to take the concept of the original Yojimbo, revisit that, and come up with the Yojimbo 2. I didn't feel the first design really got the traction or the attention that it deserved. I think the marketplace had evolved a bit since then, so what I wanted to have was have a more refined version of the Yojimbo concept. So what you have is still a compression lock mechanism, nested stainless steel liners, still have that very pronounced Wharncliffe blade profile, but what I opted for instead was a hollow ground blade instead of the flat grind of the first generation. Part of that was because of manufacturing practicalities at Spyderco. We did not have at that time the capability to do flat grinds in-house. We could do hollow grinds. So what I wanted to do was to simplify the manufacturing process, make it easier for them to produce this knife and not have any barriers to that production. So I decided on a high hollow grind. What that also does for my preferences is it leaves a lot of mass in the back portion of the blade near the spine. So when I open a knife, I open it through an inertial opening. That allows me to inertially open the knife very well, but still gives me a very narrow edge geometry that cuts very, very well. Still have the pronounced Wharncliffe blade profile. The handle ergonomics, I've shortened the handle to make it the same size as a Spyderco Delica, because the Delica is my back pocket knife. What I wanted to have, this is the Delica 4 here. I wanted to have something that was basically the same length that would fit in the back pocket if I had to carry it completely concealed. And it still has the pronounced taper to it that fits the hand, but you notice that it has a bit more of a palm swell to the back here. Ergonomically refined, just fits the hand and feels better in the hand. So that became the Yojimbo 2. That led to the first all-black knife that Spyderco made was actually the Yojimbo 2 with black liners and black blade. And then there was also a trainer version that followed a number of years after that. So this, for me, was a real boon, because if you're serious about self-defense with knives, you have to have a matching trainer, ideally something that is mechanically identical to your live blade. So this really was a godsend to have the Yojimbo trainer available as well. So one of the elements of feedback we got was from people who had either larger hands or lived in a jurisdiction where blade length restrictions were not that strict. What they wanted was the same concept as the Yojimbo 2, but in a larger platform. Sal asked me to go back to the drawing board, and the result was the Yojumbo. So the Yojumbo is basically a larger expression of the Yojimbo, 4-inch blade length, still has a compression lock mechanism, nested stainless steel liners. And the ergonomics, what I did with this was I basically tried to tune it so that these first two scallops here, if you do have normal size hands, basically that's where your hand nests. If you have a larger hand, then essentially what it allows you to do is to kind of straddle this hump here with your pinky and allow your hand to kind of extend along the full length of the handle. It also allows you to extend your thumb forward with the Filipino grip. Again, my preference as far as defensive knife use, because it allows you to use your thumb very instinctively to guide the direction of the blade. And also, again, a deep hollow grind leaves lots of mass in the spine of the blade, but still gives you very acute edge geometry. So the Yojumbo, like its predecessor, the Yojimbo 2, was also followed by an all-black version. And those also became very successful elements of the Spyderco product line. So then we fast forward to about 2021. At that time, we start getting feedback from other people in the industry, especially people who are active on the Spyderco forum. Sal is very unique in that he's an incredibly active member of the Spyderco forum, which is kind of unheard of in the knife industry, but Sal is exceptional in a lot of ways. And what he was getting was, hey, there are people who are interested in a smaller version of the Yojimbo 2, something that is smaller, more legally compliant, easier to carry in small pockets, that type of thing. Mike, would you be interested in producing something like that? I was definitely interested, but what I wanted to do is make sure that I approached that design with logic. I didn't want to just scale it down arbitrarily and say, okay, here's a smaller design, call it good. I took to heart a lot of the feedback that I'd gotten on the Yojimbo 2, some of the criticisms that we've gotten from people as far as things they didn't like about it, tried to incorporate those things, and also make sure that what I was doing was something that was consistent as far as my approach to defensive knife use, my Marshall Blade concept system. So one of the interesting things that I had done a number of years prior to that, started custom grinding Delica knives. I had one of my students who worked in a federal building where they're restricted to a 2.5-inch blade length. He was a student in NBC. He said, I want to be able to carry a knife at work, but it has to be a 2.5-inch blade length or less. What would you recommend? And what I told him was, you still want to have a full-size handle if at all possible, but just shorten the blade. So I took a Delica 4, ground it down, created what's now called a Jandelica. This happens to be a very special version of that. This was Cerakoted in denim blue by a friend of mine at 5x5 Combat Solutions. That created kind of a unique approach that was very reminiscent of the old school Yojimbos, where you'd have basically a full-size handle, but a shortened blade length. That actually became the inspiration for Car Arms exclusives. So we did the Car Arms Delica exclusives in denim blue, khaki, and black, based on that exact concept. So the 2.5-inch blade length, not only for U.S. federal buildings, but also if you look at the areas in the U.S. that have the most restrictive knife laws, Chicago and Boston, 2.5 inches is the most that you can carry. So for those areas, what I was also trying to do as far as my expression of knife tactics was to make sure that everything in the Martial Blade Concept system also would work with the knife with that blade length. So when it came time to develop the Micro Jimbo, the smaller version of the Yojimbo 2, what I wanted to do was take that 2.5-inch blade length, use that as my baseline, and then design everything from there. In the process, what I also wanted to do was to make sure that ergonomically the operation and the feel of the smaller version was very similar to the Yojimbo 2. So when you think of, if you happen to be a shooter, when you think of Glock 17, Glock 19, Glock 26, you have, starting with a full-size gun to a more compact to a subcompact, as you get smaller, all of the critical dimensions, essentially the trigger reach, where the magazine release is located, all of those details remain the same. So even though the guns are smaller, the operation of the guns doesn't seem that much different. So to do that, what I did was I actually took a second of a Yojimbo 2, didn't even disassemble it, and started grinding away at it. I fired up my belt grinder, started hogging off material and grinding it down to create a smaller knife. Obviously what that does is everything in the center here, what Spyderco calls the cockpit of the knife, the critical dimensional relationships between the round hole, the pivot pin, the stop pin, the lock face, and everything like that, all of that remained completely identical to the Yojimbo 2. But what I did was shrink everything around it. I shortened the blade, shortened the handle, and this was my first attempt at that. When I got done with it, it wasn't bad, but what I realized was I was kind of replicating the Little Native Wharncliffe. I wasn't aware we were working on the Little Native Wharncliffe at the time. I later learned that, and I realized that this was kind of redundant as far as that goes. So I went back to the drawing board again, grabbed another Yojimbo 2 second, and ground this. So one of the criticisms that we had gotten from people is that they felt that the hollow grind, and especially the way that the hollow grind reached the tip of the Yojimbo 2, it made the tip too delicate. They preferred a flat grind. So I opted for a flat grind on this. I reground this from a hollow to a flat. As we'll see in a minute, they were also, many people are very enamored with deep pocket carry clips. So I basically was designing the knife so it would have a deep pocket clip as well. So this became the prototype that I presented to Spyderco, and that led to this production version, which I dubbed the Micro Jimbo. Micro Jimbo, the micro portion of it, again, kind of taking a nod to the gun industry. When you look at full-size guns, compact guns, subcompacts, micros, that type of progression, I think that terminology is very useful, and that's why I wanted to incorporate it into the Micro Jimbo name. So what you've got is functionally a Yojimbo 2 that has been literally kind of shrunk down, leaving the middle portion of the knife exactly the same. So it's definitely shorter as far as blade length, shorter as far as handle length. It's also a little bit narrower from top to bottom as well. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this was because I also have many female students in the MBC system. Female pockets are notoriously difficult as far as carrying knives. So I wanted to create something that was small enough to be able to fit into a lady's pocket so that they could carry it readily and still have something that offered all the advantages of the Yojimbo family of designs. Still a compression lock mechanism, still nested stainless steel liners. The stop pin is a little bit different. It's a shouldered stop pin as opposed to the screw style stop pin of the Yojimbo 2, but it's in the same basic location. Again, a full flat grind. No jimping on the top, because again, I didn't want anything that was going to cause any type of abrasive abrasion against the thumb. And what you get most importantly is a sub 2.5-inch blade. So it's just under 2.5 inches, legal to carry in Boston, legal to carry in Chicago. Any place that has a 2.5-inch blade length limit, you basically can carry this legally. As far as the clip is concerned, One of the things you need to remember when it comes to clip carry of any type of knife is that there are three basic dynamics that you're trying to balance. One is the size of the knife itself, one is the size of your hand, and then the other one is the clip location. So what you want to be able to do, I'm very much a fan of tip up carry. So what I want to be able to do is to reach down into my pocket, be able to draw the knife well, and have my thumb positioned so I can automatically open the knife without having to reposition my hand on the handle. So when you look at the Yojimbo 2 and the Micro Jimbo, what's interesting is these two side by side, you'll notice that when you line up the pivot pins, that the height of the clip carry really isn't that far off. So even though this is a shorter knife and has a deep pocket carry clip, when you reach into your pocket to draw it, your hand ends up positioned very much in the same place that it would on the Yojimbo 2's handle. So again, as far as operation, as far as the ability to harness the similarity of all the cockpit elements, those critical dimensions, it puts your hand in the same place. So if you happen to be a fan of the Yojimbo 2 design, I think you're going to like the Micro Jimbo, because it literally is all the same features and benefits you have with the Yojimbo 2 design, but shrunk down. If you're a critic of the Yojimbo 2 design, let's say that you prefer a flat grind over a hollow grind, you're welcome. That's incorporated on the Micro Jimbo. You want a deep pocket carry clip instead of a traditional flat metal clip, you're welcome. It's incorporated onto the Micro Jimbo. So I really tried to take that feedback into consideration, as well as the other design characteristics, making sure that the operation of the knife was consistent with the mechanics, with the overall feel and the ergonomics that you would be accustomed to if you are already a Yojimbo 2 user. The most important thing, though, is that I am incredibly grateful to Spyderco for the opportunity to design this. This is the latest chapter in what you can see is a long legacy and a pretty full family of knives that has spanned nearly 25 years. And if it wasn't for Sal's confidence in me at the very start, his willingness to think outside the box and do things differently, which has always been a hallmark of Spyderco's approach to knife design. If it wasn't for that, I don't know that we would have tactical Wharncliffe designs today. Fortunately, thanks to him, thanks to Spyderco, and thanks to the opportunity they provided, this is the latest chapter in that story.